The scrub brush slipped from Magnolia Cassidy's raw, reddened hands as Mrs. Victoria Pemberton's sharp voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. A girl like you should know her place, Maggie. Poor folk don't get to dream above their station. Maggie looked up from where she knelt on the general store's wooden floor, her knees aching from hours of scrubbing away the dust and grime that seemed to accumulate faster than she could clean it. Mrs. Pemberton stood above her in her pristine blue silk dress, a vision of wealth and respectability that made Maggie acutely aware of her own patched cotton work dress and worn-through boots. "Yes, ma'am," Maggie whispered, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. But here's what Mrs. Pemberton and the rest of Silver Creek's high society didn't know about Magnolia Cassidy. Beneath those humble clothes and work-worn hands beat the heart of a woman who refused to be broken. They saw poverty and assumed worthlessness. They saw her scrubbing floors and decided she was meant for nothing more. They had no idea that the young woman they dismissed so easily possessed something far rarer than money or social standing. Something that would soon catch the attention of the most powerful man in 3 counties. The bell above the store's front door chimed, and Maggie felt rather than saw the shift in the room's atmosphere. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The very air seemed to hold its breath. She didn't need to look up to know that someone important had just walked in. The sudden tension radiating from Mrs. Pemberton told her everything she needed to know. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Pemberton's voice transformed from condescending ice to honeyed warmth in the span of a heartbeat. What an unexpected pleasure. Maggie kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her scrub brush moving in steady practice circles. She'd heard the name whispered with a mixture of awe and ambition throughout Silver Creek. Thaddeus Blackwood, owner of the largest cattle ranch in Colorado Territory, a man whose wealth could buy and sell entire towns, whose word carried more weight than the territorial governor's. A man who, according to the rumors that flew through Silver Creek like tumbleweeds in a windstorm, was finally ready to take a wife. "Mrs. Pemberton," came a voice that was deeper and warmer than Maggie had expected. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, not at all. We were just—" Well, Maggie here was finishing her cleaning duties. Mrs. Pemberton's tone made it clear exactly how unimportant she considered those duties, and the girl performing them. Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she continued scrubbing, invisible as always. She'd learned long ago that the best way to survive in a world that looked down on her was to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. But sometimes fate has other plans. "Excuse me, miss," that warm voice said, and Maggie realized with a start that the words were directed at her. "You drop this." Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, Maggie looked up into the kindest pair of green eyes she'd ever seen. Thaddeus Blackwood stood before her, holding out the small silver locket that had fallen from her neck. The only thing of value she owned, the last reminder of her mother. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything changed. Though neither of them knew it yet, the wealthiest man in Silver Creek had just met the woman who would turn his world upside down, and she was exactly what he'd been searching for, even if she was nothing like what everyone expected him to choose. Maggie's fingers trembled as she reached for the locket, acutely aware that every eye in the general store was fixed on this unprecedented interaction between Silver Creek's most powerful man and its most invisible woman. The silver felt warm from Thaddeus Blackwood's touch, and she clutched it protectively against her chest. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden silence that had fallen over the store. But instead of dismissing her and turning his attention to more important matters, Thaddeus remained crouched beside her, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "That's a beautiful piece," he said quietly. "Looks like it has quite a story behind it." Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath cut through the air like a blade. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you don't need to concern yourself with—" "I asked the lady a question," Thaddeus said without taking his eyes off Maggie, though his tone carried enough authority to silence Mrs. Pemberton immediately. "I'd like to hear her answer." Maggie felt heat flood her cheeks. No one had ever called her a lady before, least of all someone like Thaddeus Blackwood. She glanced nervously at Mrs. Pemberton, whose face had gone an alarming shade of purple, then back at the man waiting patiently for her response. It was my mother's, Maggie said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. She passed when I was 12. This is all I have left of her. Something shifted in Thaddeus's expression, a flicker of understanding that made Maggie wonder what losses he might have carried in his own past. I'm sorry for your loss. She must have been a remarkable woman to have raised such a... He paused, his gaze taking in her worn dress, her work-reddened hands, her chin lifted with quiet dignity, despite her circumstances. Such a gracious daughter. The compliment hit Maggie like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had said something kind about her? When had anyone looked at her and seen grace instead of poverty? Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Pemberton's voice had taken on a strained quality, as if she were fighting to maintain her composure. Perhaps you'd like to meet my Eleanor? She's just returned from finishing school in Denver, and she's been so looking forward to making your acquaintance. As if summoned by her mother's words, Eleanor Pemberton glided into the store with the practiced elegance of a woman who'd never doubted her place in the world. She was beautiful in the way that money could make beautiful, perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless complexion, a dress that probably cost more than Maggie earned in 6 months. Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor said, her voice as smooth as silk as she executed a perfect curtsy. What a delightful surprise to find you here. Thaddeus rose slowly, his eyes flickering between Eleanor's obvious beauty and Maggie, who was trying to make herself invisible again by returning to her scrubbing. Miss Pemberton, I trust you're settling back into Silver Creek after your time away? Oh yes, though I must confess the town seems rather provincial after Denver's cultural offerings. Eleanor's laugh was like tinkling bells designed to charm. Perhaps someone with your refined tastes might appreciate the difference. Maggie felt her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't want to name. Of course, Eleanor Pemberton was exactly the kind of woman a man like Thaddeus Blackwood would choose. Educated, refined, from the right family. Everything Maggie was not. I find Silver Creek has its own charms, Thaddeus replied diplomatically. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that aren't immediately obvious to everyone. His words seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone made Maggie glance up. To her surprise, she found him looking directly at her again, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Eleanor followed his look, and her perfect smile faltered for just a moment. Oh, Maggie, I didn't see you there. The dismissal in her voice was absolute. Shouldn't you be finishing your work? Mother does expect the floors to be spotless. Actually, Thaddeus said, straightening to his full height, I was hoping to speak with Miss Cassidy about something. The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth fell open. Eleanor's eyes went wide with shock, and even the other customers who'd been pretending not to listen turned to stare openly. I beg your pardon? Mrs. Pemberton managed. Miss Cassidy, Thaddeus repeated, as if it were perfectly normal for a man of his standing to request a conversation with the hired help. I have a proposition for her. Maggie felt the world tilt around her. She struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady, the scrub brush forgotten on the floor. Sir, I don't understand. Your father is Pete Cassidy, isn't he? The man who used to run the small spread east of town before the drought hit? Maggie nodded, confusion and dread warring in her chest. Her father was a painful subject, once a proud rancher, now bedridden with a persistent cough that had worsened with each passing month. The loss of their land had broken something inside him that no amount of love or care seemed able to heal. I knew your father, Thaddeus continued. Good man. Honest. He helped me out of a tight spot years ago when I was just starting out. Refused to take payment for it. His eyes softened. I heard about his illness. I also heard that you've been working yourself to the bone trying to pay for his medicine. Maggie's throat tightened. She didn't want pity, especially not in front of the Pembertons. We manage, sir. I'm sure you do. But I have a ranch that runs on 12,000 acres, and I'm in need of someone to manage the household. Someone trustworthy, hardworking, with the kind of character that can't be bought or taught. His gaze held hers steadily. Someone exactly like you. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Pemberton looked as if she might faint. Eleanor's perfect composure had cracked completely, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "You're offering her employment?" Eleanor's voice was sharp with disbelief. "I'm offering her a position that would allow her to care for her father properly while using skills I suspect she has in abundance," Thaddeus replied calmly. "The position comes with a house on the property, medical care, and wages that would ensure her family's comfort." Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes. It sounded too good to be true, which meant it probably was. Men like Thaddeus Blackwood didn't offer positions like that to women like her without expecting something in return. "What exactly would my duties entail?" she asked quietly, proud that her voice remained steady. Something flickered in Thaddeus's eyes. Respect, she realized with surprise. He'd expected her to be suspicious, and he approved of her caution. Running the household staff, managing supplies and accounts, overseeing the guest quarters when I have business associates visiting? "Nothing that would compromise your reputation or your father's," he added, and Maggie understood that he'd read the fear behind her question. "You'd have your own quarters, complete independence, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, would be there to help you adjust to the responsibilities." "This is preposterous," Mrs. Pemberton sputtered. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you can't be serious about offering such an important position to someone who's proven she can work hard, manage on next to nothing, and maintain her dignity in the face of circumstances that would crush lesser people?" Thaddeus's voice carried an edge of steel. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton, I'm quite serious." Maggie stared at him, trying to process what was happening. Was this real? Was Thaddeus Blackwood, the Thaddeus Blackwood, really offering her a chance at a better life? A chance to save her father? "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long." His smile was warm, genuine. "I have a feeling the ranch has been waiting for exactly the right person to make it a home instead of just a business, and I believe that person might be you." With that, he tipped his hat to her. Actually tipped his hat, as if she were a proper lady instead of a girl who scrubbed floors for a living, and turned to leave. "Good day, Mrs. Pemberton." "Miss Pemberton." His nod to them was polite but noticeably cooler. "Miss Cassidy, I'll be at the Frontier Hotel through tomorrow if you'd like to discuss the details." The bell chimed again as he left, and the store erupted in whispered conversations. But Maggie barely heard them. She was staring at the silver locket in her palm, remembering something her mother had told her years ago, back when the world still made sense. "Sometimes, Maggie girl," her mother had whispered during one of their last conversations, "the darkest hour comes right before the most beautiful dawn. When that time comes, you'll know it by the way it feels impossible and inevitable all at once." Standing in that general store, surrounded by people who thought they knew exactly what she was worth, Maggie felt something impossible and inevitable stirring in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, her dawn was finally coming. But first, she had to decide if she was brave enough to reach for it. The tiny cabin that Maggie called home felt even smaller than usual as she sat beside her father's bed, watching the rise and fall of his labored breathing. Pete Cassidy had once been a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and strong enough to wrestle a bull to the ground with his bare hands. Now he looked fragile as old paper, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken with the weariness of a man who'd fought too many battles and lost too many of them. "Papa?" Maggie whispered, gently touching his shoulder. "Are you awake?" Pete's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with the effort it took him to do most things these days. "Maggie, girl, you're home early. Thought you'd be scrubbing floors until sunset." The concern in his voice, even weakened as he was, made Maggie's throat tight. Her father still worried about her, still tried to be strong for her sake, even when they both knew he was the one who needed taking care of now. "Something happened today, Papa. Something I need to talk to you about." Pete struggled to sit up against his pillows, and Maggie quickly moved to help him, noting how light he felt, how fragile. The cough that had started as a minor irritation 3 years ago had slowly stolen his strength, his weight, his hope. The medicine from Doc Henley helped, but it was expensive, and there were days when Maggie had to choose between her father's comfort and putting food on the table. "What kind of something?" Pete asked, his voice rough from sleep and sickness. Maggie took a deep breath, hardly believing the words she was about to speak. Thaddeus Blackwood offered me a job. A real job, Papa. Managing his household with wages enough to get you proper care and a house for us to live in on his property. Pete's eyes widened, then narrowed with the suspicious caution of a man who'd learned that offers too good to be true usually were. Thaddeus Blackwood? The cattle baron? The same one. He said he knew you, Papa. Said you helped him out years ago when he was starting out. Wouldn't take payment for it. A strange expression crossed Pete's weathered face. Part memory, part pride, part something that looked almost like regret. That was a long time ago. He was just a kid then, maybe 22, 23. Had more ambition than sense and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Pete coughed, the sound harsh and wet. Got himself cornered by cattle rustlers up in Devil's Canyon. I happened to be passing through, helped him out of a tight spot. What kind of tight spot? The kind that would have left him dead if someone hadn't come along. Pete's gaze grew distant. 5 men with guns and bad intentions. Thad was wounded, outnumbered, and too proud to run, even when he should have. So I evened the odds a bit. Maggie stared at her father, seeing him not as the sick man he'd become, but as the protector he'd once been. You saved his life. Maybe. Or maybe he'd have found a way out on his own. He was always resourceful, that one. Pete coughed again, longer this time, and Maggie handed him the handkerchief that was never far from his reach. Point is, if Thaddeus Blackwood is offering you something, it's because he means it. That man doesn't make promises he can't keep. But Papa, it's too much. Why would someone like him want to help someone like me? What if he expects... She couldn't finish the sentence, but her father understood. Pete's eyes flashed with the fire that had once made him a force to be reckoned with in Silver Creek. Magnolia Cassidy, you listen to me. You are the daughter of Mary Elizabeth Cassidy, and she was the finest woman who ever drew breath in this territory. You've got her grace, her strength, and her good sense. Any man would be lucky to have you working for him, and don't you forget it. But the way people talk about me, the way they look at me, the way people look at you says more about them than it does about you, Pete interrupted firmly. I raised you to judge people by their character, not their bank account. Maybe it's time you started applying that same standard to yourself. Maggie felt tears burning behind her eyes. I'm scared, Papa. What if I'm not good enough? What if I embarrass you? Pete reached out with one thin hand and cupped her cheek, his touch gentle despite the tremor in his fingers. Maggie, girl, you could never embarrass me. You've been taking care of me, taking care of this household, working yourself to the bone without a word of complaint. You think managing Thaddeus Blackwood's ranch house is going to be harder than what you've already been doing? When he put it that way, Maggie had to admit he had a point. She'd been running their small household on practically nothing for years, stretching every penny, making their meager supplies last through creative cooking and careful planning. If she could make their tiny cabin livable on her cleaning wages, surely she could manage a properly funded household. Besides, Pete continued, a hint of his old humor creeping into his voice, if that boy is anything like he was 20 years ago, he probably needs someone to make sure he eats regular meals and doesn't work himself into an early grave. Some things never change. A soft knock at the cabin door interrupted their conversation. Maggie frowned. They rarely had visitors, especially this late in the day. She opened the door to find a young Mexican woman standing on their doorstep, holding a covered basket that smelled like heaven. Miss Cassidy, I am Carmen Martinez. I work for Senor Blackwood as his housekeeper. The woman's English was accented but clear, her manner warm but respectful. He asked me to bring you this and to answer any questions you might have about the position he offered. Maggie stared at the woman, then at the basket. He sent you here? Sigh. He thought you might like to know what kind of man you would be working for, and he felt you should hear it from someone who has worked for him for 5 years. Carmen's smile was genuine. May I come in? Maggie stepped aside, acutely aware of how shabby their cabin must look to someone who worked in a grand ranch house. But Carmen showed no sign of judgment as she looked around, only the practical assessment of someone who understood the difference between poverty and poor housekeeping. Your home is very clean, Carmen said approvingly. Senor Blackwood was right. You know how to make the most of what you have. She set the basket on their small table and uncovered it, revealing fresh bread, a pot of stew that smelled like beef and vegetables, and several small containers that turned out to hold spices Maggie hadn't tasted in years. "This is too much," Maggie protested. "It is dinner," Carmen said simply. "Senor Blackwood does not like the idea of people going hungry when he has plenty to share." She glanced toward Pete, who was watching the interaction with sharp interest. "You must be Senor Cassidy. Your daughter speaks of you with much love." Pete managed to smile. "She's a good girl. Takes after her mother that way." "See? This I can see." Carmen turned back to Maggie. "You want to know about Senor Blackwood? What kind of man he is to work for?" Maggie nodded, still overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "He is fair. He does not ask you to do anything he would not do himself. He pays well and on time, always. When my nephew was sick with fever 2 years ago, Senor Blackwood paid for the doctor and gave me time off to care for the boy." Carmen's expression grew serious. "But more than this, he sees people. Really sees them. Not their clothes or their money, but who they are inside." "What would my duties actually involve?" Maggie asked. "Managing the household accounts, overseeing the cleaning staff, planning meals with the cook, organizing when he has guests for business? The ranch house is large, but it is not complicated work if you have good sense and can manage people." Carmen smiled. "From what I see here, you have both." "And my father?" Mr. Blackwood said there would be medical care. Doc Henley comes to the ranch twice a week to check on the workers. There is a small house near the main house where you and your father could live. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room. Much bigger than this, and warm in winter. Maggie felt her resolve weakening. It sounded wonderful, almost too wonderful. "Why me? Surely there are other women in Silver Creek who would want such a position." Carmen's laugh was knowing. "Other women, see, but not other women who would see the position as a chance to serve instead of a chance to catch the patron's eye for marriage." Her expression grew thoughtful. "Senor Blackwood has been hurt before by women who wanted his money more than they wanted him. He needs someone he can trust, someone who will not see him as a prize to be won." "Has he said anything about marriage? About looking for a wife?" "He says nothing of marriage to me, but—" Carmen hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I will tell you this. I have worked for him 5 years, and I have never seen him look at any woman the way he looked at you today when he came back to the ranch. Like he had found something he did not know he was looking for." Maggie's heart skipped, but she forced herself to stay practical. "Even if that's true, men like him don't marry women like me." "Men like him marry women who make them happy," Carmen corrected gently. "The question is, are you brave enough to find out what makes you happy?" As Carmen prepared to leave, she pressed a small envelope into Maggie's hands. "Senor Blackwood asked me to give you this. Whatever you decide, he wants you to know the offer stands." After Carmen left, Maggie opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was more money than she usually earned in 2 months, along with a note written in the strong, decisive handwriting. "Miss Cassidy, consider this an advance on your wages, regardless of your decision. Your father's medicine is more important than my need for a housekeeper. If you choose to accept the position, report to the ranch Monday morning. If not, keep the money with my gratitude for your father's past kindness. T. Blackwood." Maggie stared at the note, then at her father, who was watching her with eyes that held both hope and resignation. "Well, Maggie girl," Pete said softly, "looks like you've got yourself a decision to make." And for the first time in years, Maggie realized she was holding her future in her own hands. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the entire world feel full of possibilities. Maggie stood at the edge of the Blackwood Ranch, clutching her single carpet bag and staring at what could only be described as a small empire. The main house rose before her like something out of a storybook. 3 stories of honey-colored stone and dark timber, with wraparound porches and tall windows that caught the morning light like jewels. Beyond it stretched barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings that spoke of wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined. In the distance, cattle dotted the rolling hills like scattered coins, and the mountains provided a backdrop that took her breath away. "Impressionante, no?" Carmen's voice came from behind her, warm with amusement. Impressive, I mean. I still remember my first day, standing right where you are now, wondering what I had gotten myself into. Maggie turned to find the housekeeper approaching with a welcoming smile and felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. It's overwhelming, she admitted. I've never seen anything like it. Senor Blackwood's grandfather built the original house, but Thaddeus has added to it over the years. Come, let me show you to your home first, then we will tour the main house. The small house Carmen led her to was anything but small by Maggie's standards. 2 bedrooms, just as promised, but also a spacious kitchen with a real cast-iron stove, a sitting room with windows that looked out over the garden, and indoor plumbing that made Maggie's eyes widen with delight. Papa's going to love this, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wooden table in the kitchen. The furniture, it came yesterday, Carmen said casually. Senor Blackwood wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. Maggie frowned. But we haven't even discussed my wages yet. How much did all this cost? He said not to worry about such things, that a comfortable employee is a productive employee. Carmen's smile suggested there was more to the story, but she didn't elaborate. Your father, he will arrive today? This afternoon. Dr. Henley is bringing him in his buggy. Maggie still couldn't quite believe that the doctor had offered to transport Pete personally, claiming it was professional courtesy, in a tone that suggested Thaddeus Blackwood's influence had something to do with it. Bueno, now let me show you the main house. There is much to learn. The tour that followed left Maggie's head spinning. The Blackwood Ranch house boasted 22 rooms, including a library that held more books than Maggie had seen in her entire life, a dining room that could seat 20, and guest quarters that were larger than most people's entire homes. But what struck her most was how lived in it felt despite its grandeur. This wasn't a show place. It was a home where a man actually lived and worked. The household staff is not large, Carmen explained as they walked through the gleaming kitchen. Maria does most of the cooking, Rosa handles the laundry and cleaning, and Juan maintains the grounds around the house. Senor Blackwood does not like having too many people underfoot. What about entertaining? Surely a man in his position must have dinner parties, business associates. See, but not often. He is, how do you say, private man. When he does have guests, it is usually business, and they stay in the guest wing. Carmen paused by a window that overlooked the front drive. But lately he talks of wanting to entertain more, to make the ranch feel less like a workplace and more like a home. Before Maggie could ask what that might mean, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A rider was coming up the drive at a pace that suggested urgency, and Maggie felt her stomach drop as she recognized the distinctive black horse and military bearing of Sheriff Tom Bradley. That does not look like social call, Carmen murmured. They watched as the sheriff dismounted and strode toward the front door with the purposeful gait of a man bearing official business. Carmen sighed and headed for the door. I will see what he wants. You should stay here and continue familiarizing yourself with the house. But Maggie found herself following Carmen anyway, curiosity and a growing sense of unease overriding her desire to avoid attention. They reached the front hall just as Carmen opened the door to admit Sheriff Bradley, whose weathered face was grim with concern. Carmen, I need to speak with Thaddeus immediately. Is he on the property? He is in the south pasture, checking on the new cattle. What is wrong, Sheriff? Bradley's eyes found Maggie standing behind Carmen, and his expression grew even more serious. Miss Cassidy, I'm surprised to find you here. She is the new household manager, Carmen said firmly, as if daring the sheriff to make something of it. Bradley's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well, that might actually be relevant to why I'm here. He turned back to Carmen. There was an incident in town last night. Someone broke into the general store and ransacked the place. Made quite a mess. Thieves? Carmen asked. That's what's strange. Nothing valuable was taken, but they did leave something behind. Bradley reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. Found this nailed to the counter where Miss Cassidy usually works. Maggie's blood turned to ice as she looked at the paper. Written in crude block letters were the words, "Poor trash doesn't belong with decent folk. Stay where you belong or suffer the consequences." Someone wanted to make sure you saw this, Bradley continued, his voice gentle but serious. I don't like anonymous threats, Miss Cassidy. They tend to escalate if not addressed properly. Carmen crossed herself. Dios mío, who would do such a thing? Maggie stared at the threatening note, her hands trembling slightly. She had a pretty good idea who might be behind it, though she couldn't prove anything. What does this mean for my position here? She asked quietly. That's not for me to decide, Bradley replied. But I will say this. If someone's trying to intimidate you, the worst thing you can do is let them succeed. Bullies get bolder when their targets show fear. The girl has done nothing wrong, Carmen said fiercely. She has every right to work wherever she chooses. I agree completely, but Miss Cassidy should be aware that accepting this position has apparently upset some people in town. People who might not be content with anonymous notes. Bradley's expression grew troubled. I'll be increasing patrols around town, and I'd suggest someone keep an eye on things here at the ranch as well. The sound of boots on the front porch announced another arrival, and Maggie's heart began to race as Thaddeus Blackwood stepped through the door. He was dressed for ranch work in leather chaps and a work shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair slightly mussed from the wind. He looked every inch of the successful rancher, and Maggie felt acutely aware of her own simple dress and nervous demeanor. Tom, Thaddeus nodded to the sheriff. Then his eyes found Maggie and his expression softened. Miss Cassidy, I'm glad to see you decided to accept the position. Senor Blackwood, Carmen interrupted before Maggie could respond. There has been trouble? Thaddeus's attention sharpened as Bradley explained about the break-in and the threatening note. Maggie watched his face grow progressively darker as the sheriff spoke, and when Bradley handed him the note, something dangerous flickered in his green eyes. Who did this? Thaddeus's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the calm. No witnesses, no evidence. But someone with a grudge against Miss Cassidy's presence here. Bradley glanced at Maggie apologetically. I hate to say it, but this has the feel of someone with social standing. Someone who thinks they can get away with intimidation. Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, reading the note again. When he looked up at Maggie, his expression was unreadable. Are you afraid? The question was direct, honest, and Maggie found herself answering with the same honesty. Yes, but not enough to run away. Something shifted in Thaddeus's expression. Approval, she realized, and something warmer that made her pulse quicken. Good, because running away won't solve this problem, and I don't hire cowards. He turned to Carmen. Double-check the locks on all the outbuildings tonight. Tom, I want to know the moment anything else happens, no matter how small. You think they'll try something else? Bradley asked. I think whoever did this is testing boundaries. They want to see if fear will accomplish what social pressure couldn't. Thaddeus looked directly at Maggie. They're about to discover that they've picked the wrong person to intimidate. His words should have been reassuring, but Maggie detected something in his tone that suggested the situation was more serious than any of them were admitting. As if sensing her thoughts, Thaddeus stepped closer. Miss Cassidy, if you're having second thoughts about the position— I'm not, Maggie interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I don't know who's behind this, but I won't let them make my decisions for me. Thaddeus smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Excellent. In that case, welcome to the Blackwood Ranch. I have a feeling you're going to fit in perfectly. But as Sheriff Bradley mounted his horse and rode away, and Carmen bustled off to check the household security, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Thaddeus's job offer had just painted a target on her back. And whoever was aiming at that target was just getting started. The Pemberton Mansion sat on Silver Creek's most prestigious hill, like a monument to social ambition, its white columns and manicured gardens a stark contrast to the rough frontier town below. Inside the ornate sitting room, Eleanor Pemberton paced before the marble fireplace with the restless energy of a caged wildcat, her silk dress rustling with each agitated step. This is intolerable, Mother. Absolutely intolerable. Eleanor's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman accustomed to getting her way. That nobody is living at the Blackwood Ranch like she belongs there, while I'm reduced to waiting for social calls that never come. Victoria Pemberton sat rigidly in her velvet armchair, her fingers gripping her teacup with enough force to crack the delicate china. The news that Maggie Cassidy had not only taken the position at the ranch, but was thriving in it, had reached them through the efficient gossip network that kept Silver Creek's social elite informed of each other's business. "Calm yourself, Eleanor. Hysterics are unbecoming in a lady of your breeding." Victoria's voice was ice-cold control, but her eyes burned with a fury that matched her daughter's. "Besides, I have it on good authority that our message was delivered successfully." Eleanor stopped pacing, her blue eyes lighting with malicious interest. "You mean the note at the general store? Do you really think that scared her off? If it didn't, then we'll simply have to be more persuasive." Victoria set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "I've been making inquiries about Miss Cassidy's situation. It seems her father is quite ill, completely dependent on her care and the wages she earns. So a woman with such vulnerabilities can be motivated in ways that a woman without dependence cannot." Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. "Thomas Hammond owes our family considerable money from his failed mining venture. I believe it's time to call in that debt." Eleanor frowned, not immediately seeing the connection. "What does Tommy Hammond have to do with anything?" "Thomas Hammond is one of Thaddeus Blackwood's closest friends and business partners. They've been friends since childhood, served in the cavalry together, built their fortunes side by side." Victoria's smile grew wider. "If Thomas were to express concerns about the suitability of Blackwood's new household manager, it might carry more weight than the opinions of townspeople." "You want Tommy to convince Thaddeus to fire her?" "I want Thomas to plant seeds of doubt about her character, her motivations, her fitness for such an important position. Men like Blackwood value the opinions of their peers above all else. If Thomas suggests that keeping such a woman in his household might damage his reputation." Victoria shrugged elegantly. "Well, what man wants to be seen as the fool who was taken in by a scheming opportunist?" Eleanor's eyes gleamed with malicious approval. "That's brilliant, Mother. But what if Tommy refuses? He's always been annoyingly principled. Thomas Hammond is 3 months behind on his loan payments, and the bank is threatening foreclosure on his property. I think he'll find our suggestion quite reasonable under the circumstances." Victoria rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the town below. "But that's only the beginning, my dear. If subtle pressure doesn't work, we'll need to be more direct." "What do you mean?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "I've been hearing interesting rumors about Magnolia Cassidy's background. It seems her family wasn't always so impoverished." Eleanor moved to stand beside her mother. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that suggest her late mother might have had secrets worth keeping." Victoria's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Secrets that could destroy what little reputation the Cassidy name still possesses, if they were to become public knowledge." "Mother, you're being mysterious." "What secrets?" Victoria turned from the window, her expression calculating. "Do you remember the scandal involving Judge Morrison's wife, about 15 years ago? The woman who disappeared one night and was never seen again?" Eleanor's eyes widened. "Adelaide Morrison? But she ran off with that traveling merchant, didn't she? Everyone said a great many things, but no one ever proved anything. What they did prove was that a considerable sum of money disappeared from the judge's safe the same night his wife vanished." Victoria's smile was triumphant. "Money that was never recovered. You think Mary Cassidy was involved?" "I think Mary Elizabeth Whitmore Cassidy arrived in Silver Creek with a newborn baby and no husband, claiming to be a widow from back east. She had enough money to buy that little spread where she and Pete Cassidy eventually settled, but no explanation for where a supposed widow might have come by such funds." Victoria moved closer to her daughter. "And I think that if certain people were to start asking questions about those funds, they might discover some very interesting connections." Eleanor stared at her mother, processing the implications. "You're talking about blackmail." "I'm talking about justice," Victoria corrected sharply. "That girl has no business living in luxury, while her betters are forced to watch from the sidelines. If her family built their modest prosperity on stolen money, then the community has a right to know." "But Mother, Even if that's true, it was her mother who, the sins of the mother fall upon the daughter, especially when the daughter benefits from those sins. Victoria's voice was hard as granite. Besides, the truth of the matter is less important than the appearance of truth. Once doubt is cast on a woman's character, it's nearly impossible to restore. A soft knock at the sitting room door interrupted their conversation. Victoria called for entry, and their housekeeper appeared with a silver tray bearing an envelope. "A message for you, ma'am." The gentleman said it was urgent. Victoria took the envelope, noting the expensive paper in masculine handwriting. Her eyebrows rose as she read the contents. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "What is it?" Eleanor demanded. "It seems our plans may be unnecessary after all." Victoria handed the letter to her daughter. "Read this." Eleanor scanned the brief message, her expression growing more excited with each line. "He wants to meet with us? Tonight? It appears we're not the only ones with concerns about Miss Cassidy's elevation in Silver Creek society." Victoria moved to her writing desk, pulling out paper and pen. "I'll send a reply immediately. This could be exactly the opportunity we've been waiting for." "Who do you think he is?" "Someone with the power to solve our problem permanently." Victoria began writing with quick, efficient strokes. "Someone who understands that some people simply don't know their place in the world." As evening fell over Silver Creek, Victoria and Eleanor Pemberton made their way to the abandoned Miller warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building had been empty since the silver mine played out 2 years earlier, its broken windows and sagging roof a testament to the boom and bust nature of frontier life. A single lantern glowed in the darkness, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. As they approached, a figure stepped out of the shadows. A man in expensive clothes whose face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Ladies!" The man's voice was cultured, educated, but there was something cold beneath the politeness. "Thank you for meeting me on such short notice." "Your message suggested this was a matter of mutual interest," Victoria replied carefully. "I assume you're referring to the situation at the Blackwood Ranch." "Indeed. It seems we all share a concern about certain undesirable elements being elevated beyond their proper station." The man stepped closer, and in the lamplight, Eleanor caught a glimpse of a face she recognized but couldn't quite place. "I have a proposition that might resolve our mutual problem." "What kind of proposition?" Eleanor asked, her voice slightly breathless with excitement. "The kind that ensures Miss Cassidy not only loses her position at the ranch, but finds herself unwelcome in Silver Creek entirely." The man's smile was visible now, cold and predatory. "But it will require careful coordination and absolute discretion." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes glittering with interest. "Tell us more." What followed was a conversation that would have chilled the blood of anyone who cared about justice or mercy. Plans were made, roles assigned, and contingencies discussed with the methodical precision of a military campaign. By the time the meeting ended, Magnolia Cassidy's enemies had formed an alliance that would stop at nothing to destroy her newfound happiness. As the mysterious man disappeared back into the shadows and the Pemberton women made their way home, none of them noticed the figure hidden behind the broken timbers at the warehouse's edge. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been tracking rumors of unusual activity in the abandoned building, and what he'd overheard tonight confirmed his worst fears about the forces arrayed against Maggie Cassidy. The question now was whether he could get word to Thaddeus Blackwood in time to prevent the disaster that was coming. Because if the plan Bradley had just witnessed was allowed to proceed, it wouldn't just destroy Maggie's reputation, it would destroy her life, her father's health, and possibly her very survival. The game had just become deadly serious, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. Back at the Blackwood Ranch, Maggie was settling her father into his new bedroom, completely unaware that her enemies were closing in, like wolves circling wounded prey. She tucked the blankets around Pete's thin frame and smiled at the peace in his face, the first genuine peace she'd seen there in months. "Sleep well, Papa," she whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. Outside the window, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of rain and something else, something that felt like danger approaching on silent feet. The battle for Maggie's future was about to begin, and she didn't even know she was at war. Dawn was still an hour away when Sheriff Tom Bradley's horse thundered up the drive to the Blackwood Ranch. the animal's hooves striking sparks from the stone path in the pre-dawn darkness. Tom had ridden hard through the night, his mind racing faster than his mount as he processed what he'd witnessed at the Miller warehouse. The ranch house was dark except for a single light burning in what Tom knew to be Thaddeus's study. The man was an early riser, often starting his day before the sun with coffee and correspondence. Tom hoped that habit would work in their favor today. They were going to need every advantage they could get. He dismounted and strode to the front door, not bothering with the niceties of proper calling hours. This was an emergency, and social conventions could go to hell. His sharp knock echoed through the morning stillness. Thaddeus opened the door himself, already dressed for the day, but with his shirt sleeves rolled up and ink stains on his fingers. His green eyes sharpened as he took in Tom's disheveled appearance and the urgency written across his face. "Tom, what's happened? We need to talk. Now. And you're going to want to wake Miss Cassidy for this conversation." Tom stepped inside without invitation, his boots tracking mud across the polished floors. "They're coming for her, Thad. All of them. And it's worse than we thought." Thaddeus closed the door, his expression growing grim. "Who's coming for her?" "The Pembertons, for starters. But they've got allies now. Powerful ones." Tom ran a hand through his graying hair. "I was tracking reports of unusual activity at the old Miller warehouse last night. What I found was a conspiracy that would make a politician proud." "Coffee first," Thaddeus said, leading Tom toward the kitchen. "Then you tell me everything. And I mean everything." As they moved through the quiet house, Carmen appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a shawl and looking concerned. She'd obviously heard the commotion and come to investigate. "Senor Blackwood, is everything all right? Carmen, would you please ask Miss Cassidy to join us in the kitchen? Tell her it's urgent, but she doesn't need to worry about her father. This doesn't concern his health." Carmen nodded and hurried away while Thaddeus poured coffee for both men. Tom noticed that his friend's hands were steady despite the circumstances, a trait that had served them both well during their cavalry days. "Now talk," Thaddeus said, settling into a chair across from Tom. "Victoria Pemberton is behind the threat at the general store. But that was just the beginning. She's been digging into Maggie's family history, looking for ammunition." Tom took a sip of the strong coffee, using the brief pause to organize his thoughts. "She claims she has evidence linking Maggie's mother to the Adelaide Morrison disappearance 15 years ago. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "The judge's wife who vanished with the missing money?" "The same." Victoria's spinning a theory that Mary Cassidy was involved somehow, that the money Maggie's parents used to buy their land came from that theft. Tom leaned forward. "Now, I knew Mary Cassidy, and she was as honest as the day is long. But the truth doesn't matter if the lie's convincing enough." "What else?" "Victoria's pressuring Thomas Hammond to turn you against Maggie. Something about his debts and threatening foreclosure if he doesn't cooperate." Tom's expression darkened. "But that's not the worst part." The soft sound of footsteps announced Maggie's arrival. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a simple blue dress, her hair hastily pinned, but her eyes alert and concerned. "Carmen said you needed to see me urgently?" "Sit down, Maggie," Thaddeus said gently, using her first name without seeming to realize it. "Tom has some information you need to hear." Maggie took the chair beside Thaddeus, close enough that Tom could see her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "What kind of information?" Tom studied her face, seeing the same quiet strength that had impressed him from their first meeting. "There's a group of people in Silver Creek who want you gone from this ranch and from this town. They're willing to go to considerable lengths to make that happen." "The Pembertons," Maggie said without surprise. "Among others." "But Maggie, they've recruited someone with real power, someone who was at that warehouse meeting last night, but stayed in the shadows." Tom's voice grew grave. "I couldn't see his face clearly, but I heard enough to know he's got resources the Pembertons don't. And he's planning something that goes beyond social pressure or gossip." Thaddeus leaned forward. "What kind of something?" "The kind that could destroy her completely. Not just her job, not just her reputation, but her ability to survive anywhere in this territory." Tom turned to Maggie. "They know about your father's condition. They know how dependent you are on this position, and they're planning to use that against you." Maggie's face went pale. but her chin lifted with the stubborn courage Tom had come to recognize. Let them try. I haven't done anything wrong. That's not how this works, and you know it, Tom said gently. In a small town, accusation and truth are often the same thing. If the right people start spreading the right lies. What lies? Thaddeus's voice carried an edge of steel. Tom hesitated, then decided they needed to know everything. They're going to claim that your mother stole money from Judge Morrison's safe the night Adelaide Morrison disappeared, that your family's land was bought with stolen funds, that you've been living off criminal proceeds your entire life. The silence that followed was deafening. Maggie stared at Tom as if he'd struck her face cycling through shock, hurt, and finally a burning anger that reminded Tom why he'd always liked her spirit. My mother was the most honest woman who ever lived, Maggie said, her voice tight with controlled fury. She worked herself to death trying to make that farm succeed. How dare they? Easy, Thaddeus said quietly, reaching over to cover her clenched fist with his hand. Tom's not the enemy here. He's trying to warn us about what's coming. The context seemed to calm Maggie, though Tom noticed that neither of them moved to break it. Interesting development there, though hardly surprising given the circumstances. Is there any way to prove the allegations false? Thaddeus asked. That's just it. There's no way to prove they're true either. The whole case was a mess from the start. Adelaide Morrison disappeared, money was missing, but no one ever found evidence of who took it or where they went. Tom shook his head. It's the perfect crime to pin on someone who can't defend herself because she's been dead for years. So what do we do? Maggie asked. We get ahead of it, Thaddeus said firmly. Tom, what exactly did you hear at that warehouse? Every detail. For the next 20 minutes, Tom recounted everything he'd witnessed, from the Pembertons' cold planning to the mysterious figure's promises of total destruction. He watched Maggie's face grow more determined with each revelation and saw something fierce and protective growing in Thaddeus's expression. They underestimate her, Thaddeus said finally. They think because she's poor and alone, she'll be easy to break. They don't know Maggie very well, do they? Tom said with a slight smile. No, they don't. Thaddeus squeezed Maggie's hand. The question is, are you willing to fight this? Because it's going to get ugly before it gets better. Maggie looked between the two men, these unlikely allies who were offering to stand with her against forces that had much more power and influence than she'd ever possessed. Her mother's locket felt warm against her chest, a reminder of the woman who taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite the fear. They want to destroy my mother's memory to hurt me, she said quietly. They want to use my father's illness as a weapon. They think poverty makes me weak. Her voice grew stronger. They're about to learn how wrong they are. Thaddeus smiled, and Tom saw something in his friend's expression that he'd never seen before. Pride mixed with something deeper, something that looked remarkably like love. Good, Thaddeus said, because I have some ideas about how to turn their own weapons against them. What kind of idea? Tom asked. The kind that require us to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than they expect. Thaddeus stood, his expression hardening with resolve. If they want a war, they'll get one. But they might not like how it ends. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was going to be a beautiful day, Tom reflected. Too bad it was probably going to be the calm before one hell of a storm. But as he looked at Maggie and Thaddeus standing together, their hands still linked and their faces set with determination, he found himself thinking that their enemies might have bitten off more than they could chew. The battle was coming, but for the first time since this whole mess started, Tom Bradley was beginning to think they might actually win it. The Silver Creek Town Hall had never seen such a crowd. Word had spread through the community like wildfire that there would be a public meeting to address serious allegations concerning certain residents and their fitness for respectable society. Victoria Pemberton had made sure the invitation sounded official enough to draw the curious and ominous enough to guarantee attendance. She stood now at the front of the packed room, resplendent in her finest black silk dress, looking every inch the moral authority she believed herself to be. Eleanor sat in the front row, her perfect posture and cold smile suggesting she was thoroughly enjoying the spectacle about to unfold. Behind them, Partially concealed by the crowd sat Thomas Hammond, his face drawn with the weight of the choice he'd been forced to make. His debts to the Pemberton family had left him with no alternatives, or so he'd convinced himself. The fact that he'd known and respected Pete Cassidy for years made what he was about to do even more bitter. But survival sometimes required distasteful compromises. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, "we gather tonight to address a matter that affects the very moral foundation of our community." At the back of the hall, Maggie sat between Thaddeus and Sheriff Bradley, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the storm brewing around her. She wore her best dress, the same blue one she'd worn on her first day at the ranch, and carried herself with a dignity that would have made her mother proud. "For too long," Victoria continued, "we have allowed sentiment and misguided charity to cloud our judgment about who belongs in positions of trust and responsibility in Silver Creek." "Get to the point, Victoria," called out Doc Henley from the middle of the room. "Some of us have patience to tend to." Victoria's smile tightened, but she pressed on. "Very well. I stand before you tonight to reveal information about the Cassidy family that calls into question everything we thought we knew about their character and their right to live among decent people." She gestured dramatically toward the back of the room, and Maggie felt every eye in the place turn toward her. But instead of the shame and fear Victoria clearly expected to see, Maggie met those gazes with calm courage, her chin lifted and her eyes clear. 15 years ago, Adelaide Morrison disappeared from this town, along with a substantial sum of money from her husband's safe. That crime was never solved. The money never recovered. Victoria's voice grew stronger, sensing the crowd's attention. "Until now." Thomas Hammond stood reluctantly, his face pale but his voice steady as he began to speak. "I have evidence suggesting that Mary Cassidy, Magnolia's mother, was present in Judge Morrison's house the night of the disappearance. Evidence that she may have been involved in—" "That's enough." The voice that cut through Thomas's testimony was quiet but carried with absolute authority. Thaddeus Blackwood rose from his seat, his presence commanding immediate attention. But to everyone's surprise, he wasn't looking at Thomas or Victoria. He was looking at a figure who'd been sitting in the shadows near the door. "Judge Morrison," Thaddeus continued, "don't you think it's time you told these good people the truth about what really happened that night?" A collective gasp went through the crowd as Judge Morrison stood, his aged frame trembling, not with infirmity, but with emotion. The man who'd served as Silver Creek's moral and legal authority for over 20 years looked every one of his 70-plus years as he made his way toward the front of the room. "Judge Morrison?" Victoria's voice cracked with uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" "We didn't invite." "No, you didn't," the old judge said, his voice heavy with years of carried guilt. "But it's time I faced what I should have faced 15 years ago." He turned to address the crowd, his eyes finding Maggie's across the room. "Miss Cassidy, I owe you and your mother's memory an apology that's 15 years overdue." The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Victoria's face had gone white as she began to understand that her carefully orchestrated attack was about to backfire spectacularly. "Adelaide Morrison didn't disappear," Judge Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I sent her away. My wife had been unstable for months. Violent episodes, threats against herself and others. The night she supposedly vanished, she attacked our housekeeper with a fireplace poker." He paused, looking around the room at faces reflecting shock and growing understanding. "Mary Cassidy was our housekeeper's daughter, visiting that night to help tend to Adelaide during one of her spells. When Adelaide became violent, Mary helped subdue her and likely saved both our lives." The judge's voice broke slightly. "I should have honored her heroism. Instead, I let fear and pride guide my actions." "What about the missing money?" someone called out. "There was no missing money." "I gave Adelaide funds to start a new life in a sanitarium back east, away from the pressures that had driven her to madness. I gave Mary Cassidy money too. Payment for her service and her silence about my wife's condition." Judge Morrison's shoulders straightened. "I invented the theft story to protect my wife's reputation and my own political career. Mary Cassidy was not a criminal. She was a hero who helped save lives and kept a family secret for 15 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria Pemberton looked as if she'd been struck by lightning, while Eleanor had gone pale as parchment. Thomas Hammond sank back into his seat, relief and shame warring across his features. But it was Thaddeus who broke the silence, rising to address the crowd with the kind of commanding presence that made men follow him into battle. "Since we're here to discuss character and reputation," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "let me tell you about the woman Victoria Pemberton would have you condemn." He turned to look at Maggie, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable to everyone present. Magnolia Cassidy has spent the last 3 years working herself to exhaustion to care for her ailing father and keep their family together. She's managed my household with skill and integrity that would shame a trained professional. She's shown kindness to my staff, wisdom in her decisions, and grace under pressure that would break lesser people. Thaddeus stepped closer to Maggie, extending his hand to help her stand. But more than that, she's shown me what real courage looks like. The courage to work hard without complaint, to maintain dignity in the face of prejudice, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. Maggie rose, her hand in his, and faced the crowd that had come to condemn her, with her head held high. "Which brings me to the real reason I asked Judge Morrison to attend tonight's meeting," Thaddeus continued, "because I want all of Silver Creek to witness this moment." To Maggie's shock and the crowd's amazement, Thaddeus dropped to one knee right there in front of everyone, still holding her hand in his. "Magnolia Cassidy," he said, his voice strong and clear, "you've taught me that real worth has nothing to do with money or social standing. You've shown me that a woman of true character is worth more than all the shallow society belles in 3 counties. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal hit the room like a thunderbolt. Maggie stared down at Thaddeus, tears streaming down her face, hardly able to believe what was happening. This man, this wonderful, powerful, kind man, was choosing her. Not despite her poverty, but because of who she was beneath it. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I will marry you." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, with the notable exceptions of the Pembertons, who looked as if they'd been turned to stone. But Maggie barely heard the noise over the sound of her own heart racing as Thaddeus stood and pulled her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their engagement and their triumph over those who tried to destroy them. When they finally broke apart, Thaddeus addressed the crowd one final time. "Let me be clear about something. My future wife will be treated with the respect due to the lady of the Blackwood Ranch. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to take it up with me personally." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable in its sincerity. Several men in the crowd nodded their agreement, while others began approaching to offer congratulations. But it was Sheriff Bradley who provided the evening's final surprise. "Mrs. Pemberton," he called out as Victoria tried to slip away unnoticed, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation about the break-in at the general store. Seems I have a witness who can place you near the scene that night." Victoria's face went from white to red to white again as she realized that her attempt to destroy Maggie had not only failed but had exposed her own criminal activities. As the crowd began to disperse, some to celebrate the engagement and others to gossip about the evening's revelations, Maggie found herself standing in the midst of what felt like a miracle. Her reputation was restored, her mother's memory honored, and the man she'd come to love had just asked her to share his life. "Are you sure about this?" she asked Thaddeus quietly as they walked out into the cool evening air. "Marrying me won't exactly raise your social standing." Thaddeus stopped and cupped her face in his hands, his green eyes serious but warm. "Magnolia Cassidy, you've raised everything about my life. My spirits, my hope, my understanding of what really matters. If that's not social elevation, I don't know what is." As they walked back toward the ranch together, Maggie thought about her mother's words about the darkest hour coming before the most beautiful dawn. She'd been right, as usual. The darkness had been real and frightening, but the dawn that followed was more beautiful than anything Maggie could have imagined. Behind them, Silver Creek buzzed with news of the engagement, the revelations about the Morrison case, and the fall of the Pemberton family's social empire. But ahead of them lay a future built on love, respect, and the understanding that true worth couldn't be measured in dollars or social standing. Sometimes the poorest girl in town really could capture the heart of the richest man around. Not because she tried to be something she wasn't, but because she had the courage to be exactly who she was. And that, Maggie reflected, as Thaddeus's hand squeezed hers in the darkness, was worth more than all the gold in Colorado territory. 2 years later, the Blackwood Ranch hosted the most magnificent spring celebration Silver Creek had ever seen. The rolling hills were painted with wildflowers, and the air buzzed with laughter, music, and the joyful chaos of a community coming together to honor love. Magnolia Blackwood stood on the wraparound porch of her home, watching her husband demonstrate rope tricks to a group of fascinated children. Thaddeus had insisted on organizing the annual ranch picnic, not just for their workers, but for the entire town, a tradition that had quickly become Silver Creek's most anticipated event. "Mrs. Blackwood," Carmen called from the kitchen doorway, "the last of the pies are ready. Should I have them carried to the tables?" Maggie smiled at the title she still wasn't entirely used to hearing. "Please do, Carmen. And thank you for everything you've done to make today perfect." The transformation in her life sometimes felt like a dream. The small house she and her father had shared was now a guest cottage, while she lived as mistress of one of Colorado Territory's grandest homes. But what amazed her most wasn't the luxury. It was how naturally she'd grown into the role. How her years of managing on nothing had prepared her to manage abundance with grace and wisdom. Pete Cassidy's health had improved dramatically with proper medical care, and the peace of mind that came from seeing his daughter truly happy. He spent his mornings tending the ranch's vegetable garden and his afternoons teaching the workers' children to read, having discovered a gift for education that had lain dormant during his struggling years. "Maggie," Thaddeus called from the yard, his face bright with the joy that had become his permanent expression since their wedding. "Come settle an argument. The children want to know if you really used to scrub floors for a living." She laughed and made her way down to join the group, noting how naturally Thaddeus included her in every aspect of ranch life, how he sought her opinion on everything from business decisions to the color of new curtains. Their marriage had become the kind of partnership she'd once thought existed only in fairy tales. "I did indeed scrub floors," she told the wide-eyed children, "and I was proud of the work, because honest work is always honorable, no matter what kind it is." "But weren't you sad about being poor?" asked little Susan Miller, the banker's daughter. Maggie considered the question seriously. "I was sad about not being able to help my father as much as I wanted to, but I was never ashamed of who I was or where I came from. The most important things, kindness, courage, honesty, don't cost anything to give." She caught Thaddeus watching her with that expression of wonder and love that still made her heart skip, even after 2 years of marriage. He often said she'd taught him about true wealth, but she knew the lesson had gone both ways. He'd shown her that real love wasn't about what someone could give you, but about how they chose to see you. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the ranch entrance, where Judge Morrison was arriving with Doc Henley and Sheriff Bradley. The three men had become regular fixtures at ranch gatherings, forming an unlikely friendship with Thaddeus, based on mutual respect and shared values. Victoria Pemberton, they'd heard, had left Silver Creek in disgrace after serving 6 months for vandalism and making false accusations. Eleanor had married a traveling salesman and moved to California, apparently deciding that a fresh start was preferable to trying to rebuild her reputation in a town that had witnessed her family's spectacular fall from grace. "You know what I love most about today?" Thaddeus asked quietly, slipping his arm around Maggie's waist as they watched their guests enjoying themselves. "What's that?" "Looking at all these people and knowing that not one of them is here because they have to be or because they want something from us. They're here because this place has become a home where everyone is welcome." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's your doing, Mrs. Blackwood." "Our doing," she corrected, leaning into his warmth. "Everything we've built together." As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any treasure, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a girl scrubbing floors and wondering if she'd ever be worthy of love, to a woman who'd learned that worthiness wasn't something you earned from others. It was something you claimed for yourself. Hey there, Wild West lovers. Did Maggie and Thaddeus's incredible love story move your heart? This tale proves that real love sees beyond social status, beyond wealth, beyond what others think you're worth. Sometimes the richest person in the room is the one with the biggest heart, not the biggest bank account. If this story touched your soul, here's how you can help us keep bringing you these amazing tales. Smash that like button if you believe true love conquers all social barriers. Subscribe to Wild West Stories for more epic tales of frontier romance, where love always finds a way against impossible odds. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just restore your faith in love. Comment below and tell us, have you ever felt judged for your circumstances? How did you find the courage to prove your worth? Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their value isn't determined by their bank account. Coming up next week, the heartbreaking story of a Native American woman who saved a dying cavalry officer's life, only to discover he was the man sent to relocate her people. When duty collides with gratitude and forbidden love blooms in the shadow of war, can two hearts from opposing worlds forge a peace that their peoples cannot? Remember, every person has worth that goes far deeper than what meets the eye. In a world that often judges by appearances, be the one who sees hearts. Until next time, keep believing in love that conquers all, and never forget, you are exactly as valuable as the love you give. Wild West Stories, where every heart finds its home, every dreamer discovers their destiny, and love always, always wins.